For 8 years he lived like a ghost on a nameless plain where the sun scorched every last hope. His shack, small as a coffin, held the weight of days no one remembered. His name, if it ever existed, had long been carried off by the wind. Then, beneath a noonday sun, burning red like blood, 10 Apache warriors appeared, silent like ghosts from another time. The one in front reached out and touched the gate, letting fall a silk handkerchief embroidered with the image of a wild horse. He looked at it, and for the first time he heard the sound of his own heartbeat. Part 1. The Man and the Nameless House. Out on the plain with no address, he lived with the wind and the silence. The wind swept over the rusted tin roof, stirred red dust into the yard, then vanished through a gap in the broken fence. A lone wooden house stood in the middle of a barren plain, where scorched grass grew low and scattered, like memories that had lost their way. No sign, no number. If anyone asked, folks would say, "Just follow the dirt road west, past the solitary cypress, and turn where the sun sets." If you see a thin wisp of smoke rising in the dusk, that's Jed's place. Jed Boone had lived there nearly 8 years. No one kept track of time for him, and he never asked them to. His days were not measured by calendar, but by repetition. Lighting the stove, boiling water, patching the shed roof, salting the scratches on the old dining table to keep the termites out. Even his own shadow appeared only at dawn, when the sun hadn't yet burned the dew off the glass. By daylight he lived like a shadow himself, unseen and with no one left to see. A pocket watch hung by the door next to a rusty key hook and a fraying rope, whose purpose had been long forgotten. The watch had stopped ticking long ago. Each time Jed walked in, he glanced at it, a habit from another life, a life once filled with busy hours and promises of return. Now the hands forever pointed to 11:07, and Jed no longer wished to fix it. Rufus, the gray-haired hunting dog, had grown older through 7 winters. He no longer barked like before, only trailed silently behind Jed, as if carrying a memory no one wanted to speak aloud. Each morning he sat on the porch while Jed made coffee, not for the coffee, but maybe for the ritual, or maybe out of fear that if he left, he'd be the last creature alive who remembered the man once existed. Jed's home wasn't large, but everything had its place. Blankets folded precisely in quarters, coat hanging by the kitchen door, rifle cleaned and resting on the wooden rack, as if waiting for someone who no longer came. From the dining table you could see a distant mountain ridge slicing the horizon. In autumn evenings the sun dipped behind it, bathing Jed's roof in a pale light, the color of old memories. He didn't speak to anyone. Once a month a supply truck passed by. The driver would leave goods in a wooden chest by the gate and drive off before dark. They never saw each other. They didn't need to. In those 8 years, only the weeds had dared to trespass into his world, and he never chased them away. Jed once had a gentle voice. He used to tell stories to his son in that voice, on nights when the wind beat against the windows and darkness swallowed the plains. Now his voice was hoarse and short, so much so that even he found it strange when he tried to speak. He hadn't laughed in a long time, not out of sorrow, but because nothing seemed worth the effort. The house once had a name. His wife gave it, Sun's Hollow. But after she passed, he took the wooden sign off the porch. He couldn't bear to hear the name anymore. Now the place had no name, just as he hadn't been called by his in years. Jed didn't feel lonely, at least that's what he told himself. When solitude becomes so familiar it coats the world like dust, people stop naming it. He called it silence. But sometimes on a gray afternoon with mist in the air, when Rufus curled up in a corner and the fire dwindled to glowing coals, Jed looked out the window and felt something he couldn't quite describe, a stillness like someone forever waiting on someone who would never return. And in those moments he wondered, if someone knocked tomorrow, would he even remember how to open the door? Part 2. The Lamp That Burned Till Morning. He wasn't waiting for anyone, but every night he made 2 servings of supper. At sunset, the ground around Jed's house changed color like aged skin. Darker, worn, speckled with old scars. The grass stood still. No birds, no hoofbeats, only wind weaving through the cracks in the wooden boards, carrying the cool, fine dust of twilight. Jed sat down at the table just as the sky turned violet. He never ate right away, never had. The rice was done when the yard was still awash in amber light, but he always waited for his own shadow to tilt against the wall, like it was signaling something unspoken. When he finally took the first spoonful, the wooden chair across from him remained empty. Always that chair, always that exact spot, facing the oil lamp's glow. Dinner was served in 2 bowls, one full placed before him. The other, just a little less, sat in front of the empty chair. No cup, no spoon, no one there. But that portion was always present, like an old ritual no one witnessed. Rufus lay under the table, head resting on Jed's foot, eyes open but asking for nothing. He too was used to the second bowl, and never went near it. The old dog seemed to understand that it wasn't food. It was a memory waiting. The lamp sat at the table's edge, fueled with hand-filtered pine oil, the one thing Jed had in abundance. Its glow was dim, too faint to read by, but enough to cast the shadow of that empty chair against the glass. Some nights Jed would just sit, staring at the flickering flame, not thinking, not remembering, just sitting, like a bare tree in still wind, no longer hoping for spring, no longer waiting for anyone to return. In winter, the lamp burned longer. He added more oil than usual. When the cold made the floorboards groan beneath his feet, he still sat there, not from hunger, but because he couldn't keep eating alone forever. It wasn't that he didn't know the person wouldn't return. It was that some part of him refused to stop setting a place, refused to let go of warmth, of a presence he could no longer name. Sometimes in fleeting moments when the wind slipped through the cracks and trembled the flame, the shadow of the chair on the wall would quiver just slightly, as if someone had shifted just about to sit down. But there was never anyone, only the flames dance, and Jed continued eating in silence. When the meal was done, he washed his own bowl and left the other untouched, moved it aside, covered it with an old wooden plate, not eaten, not discarded. He stoked the fire in the stove, walked once around the house, checking each lock. But the oil lamp, he never blew it out. It burned all night while Jed lay facing the wall, while Rufus breathed gently at the foot of the bed, while wind rattled the walls and the plains lay blank as unwritten paper. The lamp burned still, as if to remind him that it was not yet time to extinguish the last thing he had left. And if someone, by rare chance, passed the plain at that hour, what would they see? Only a faint yellow glow on the edge of the land, flickering like a word never spoken, lost in the fog of night. Part 3. The days without voices, days piled up like dust on a door, never opened, never wiped away. Days here did not begin with bells, nor end with gunfire, like in other corners of the West. They began with the sound of water dripping from the roof into a wooden bucket, catching the night's dew, then the slow, heavy creak of footsteps on dry floorboards. Jed rose before sunlight could reach the far mountains. No alarm, no watch. His body had learned to rise with silence, the only thing that had never betrayed him in 8 long years. The fire was kindled from leftover coals in the stove. Some mornings it caught quickly. Some took 3 tries. Jed didn't hurry. He bent low, face near the earth, blowing steadily. Each breath slow and measured like a man praying. Alone. No voices, no words spoken. No one called him Jed anymore, not even he said the name aloud. After boiling water, he poured some into a basin to wash his face. The rest went into his coffee, no sugar, no milk. On the table lay a worn notebook, faded ink, yellowed pages. Each morning he opened it and wrote a single line. Dry sky. No rain, or sometimes just still breathing. The bean field behind the house was as barren as the heart of a man who'd stopped hoping. Still Jed walked the rows daily, stooping to pick pests off with bare hands. The way he tended the soil with care and patience was like tending a loved one on their deathbed, knowing it was hopeless but refusing to walk away. The apple tree by the porch once bore crisp red fruit in autumn. Mrs. Boone used them to bake pies, the scent drifting as far as the back fence. Since she passed, the tree lived on, but never bore again. Still, Jed watered it, pruned the dead leaves. Sometimes he'd pat the trunk lightly, like a wordless hello, because he didn't know what else to do, except go on loving what had already let him go. Time passed without asking why. Once a stray cat had wandered here, dirty white fur, blind in one eye. It came in the spring of the 4th year, lay on the porch for 3 days, then left without a sound. Jed didn't try to keep it, but after it left, he folded a clean cloth and placed it on that step, and for a week, no one stepped there. The door stayed closed, but the window stayed ajar, as if he wished some strange sound might drift in. A horse's hooves, perhaps, or even just a song sung off-key from far away. But there was nothing, only crickets, only wind, only the sounds of yesterday. Rufus aged visibly. He no longer ran, only plodded behind Jed like a shadow with shape. Each evening when Jed sat in the wooden chair on the porch, the dog lay beside him, head resting on the step, eyes open, staring at nothing. They sat like that, each a loneliness with shape, with years, with a name long forgotten. Jed owned an old radio, battery-powered. Years ago he could hear voices, weather forecasts, town news, country songs floating in from the valley. Now it only played static, like rain falling in memory. Still he turned it on every night to hear nothing. Now and then he would rise in the middle of the night, step into the yard, and gaze toward the horizon as if something might finally call him back. But the plain gave him only wind, and wind never stays, never tells its story. Day followed day like dust on a door, never opened, never cleaned. And Jed, caught in that rhythm, neither lived nor died. He simply existed, waiting without giving his waiting a name. Or part 4, a door that once opened. Before he went silent, he believed in people. Behind the house, just past the old stable, was a patch of land fenced in low. Nothing grew there, no animals roamed, only a single mound raised slightly above the soil, and a weathered wooden post leaning westward, its carving long faded, as if grief had clawed the words away. Jed didn't visit often, but whenever he passed, he turned his face, the way one avoids looking straight into the face of a lost dream. Years ago, the front door to his house had opened, and not just once. Back then, Jed was a man of the town. He mended barns for neighbors, rode out to deliver medicine, brought cornbread to the church during winters. Mrs. Boone, his wife, once said, "We may not have much, but if we've got more than one bowl of soup, we're not poor." Then, one pale morning, with the rooster still calling from the hill, Jed saw an Apache child, maybe 10 years old, collapsed by the irrigation ditch. His face was bruised, arm bleeding, eyes wide like a wounded fawn who hadn't yet understood what had happened. No one followed. No one explained. Jed carried him inside. Mrs. Boone bathed him, cleaned his wounds, made porridge. The boy didn't speak for 3 days, but on the 4th he sat up and pointed to the firewood, as if asking to tend the flame. People found out. News spread quick. Boone's harboring an Indian kid. Might be a spy. No proof, no questions. That night 3 men rode up. No uniforms, but each with a gun. They didn't knock. They didn't need a reason. Jed was in the feed shed stacking sacks when he heard the shot, one shot. Then silence. When he rushed back, the front door was wide open. The boy was gone, and his son, Daniel, lay crumpled on the porch, blood pouring from his side, as if someone had torn half of Jed's heart and thrown it to the ground. No one was arrested. No one apologized. They said, "We thought he was the Apache kid." Jed didn't argue. He just looked at them, trying to carve their faces into stone with his eyes. After that, the door never opened again. He buried Daniel behind the stable, where the boy used to play with Rufus, where the evening sun tilted softly through the fence. Mrs. Boone couldn't bear it. A month later she collapsed beside the hearth. Her heart gave out mid-fold, still clutching the embroidered cloth. Jed sat there, holding her hand. It was the last time his hand held another still warm with life. Since then, everything was locked. Love, the front door, his voice, his trust. Jed tore the nameplate from the fence, cut all ties with the town, stored away unsent letters, and buried the part of himself that once knew how to smile beneath the earth behind the stable. Some nights, rare and cold, he'd stand at the door, hand on the latch, as if to open it. But he always let go. The door that once opened had become a witness to something he no longer dared name. Only a shallow dip remained in the floorboards, right where the door used to swing open, where little Daniel once stood waiting for his father to come home. Time had not erased it. Jed never stepped there again, not from fear, but because he couldn't bear the feel of standing on a spot where hope once lived. Part 5. 10 figures in the red dust. They didn't ask, didn't speak. They just stood there in the noonday sun, like a silent crack on dry earth. That day began like any other. Jed woke when light first touched the kitchen wall. He lit the fire, brewed coffee, scattered feed for the chickens, then split a few logs he'd brought in the day before. Rufus lay stretched on the porch, eyes half closed, his old body sun-bleached like weathered timber. Noon came slowly. Under the harsh sun, the light across the plain was no longer golden. It turned a pale white, as if the sky and soil had both grown tired. No wind, only dust. Dust rose in the distance, along a dirt path no one used anymore. It wasn't thick, but it clung like a feeling that hadn't yet found its name. Jed saw them first through the kitchen window, a group, 10, maybe more, approaching from the southeast. No horses, no wagons. They walked slowly, shoulders bowed beneath sun and silence. Some carried children, some leaned on sticks. The rest moved with the weight of people who'd walked too far for too long. Jed didn't move. He just watched. Rufus noticed them later. He lifted his head, gave a low whine, but didn't bark. Even he knew this wasn't a group to drive away. When they reached the fence, Jed saw clearly 10 Apache women, each one with a fine layer of dust on her face, but the weariness beneath was far deeper than dust. None of them spoke, none knocked. They simply stood there, not advancing, not retreating. Between them and the porch lay a patch of dirt, not wide, but full of distance. No one crossed it. One woman, perhaps the eldest, wore a coarse scarf on her head. She squinted against the sun, cradling a small girl, asleep on her shoulder. She stood slightly to the left, neither stepping forward nor back. The child stirred in her arms, fingers twitching in the air, like dreaming of a river long lost. They didn't plead, they didn't challenge, they simply were. 10 figures torn from a painting left unfinished, blown here by wind, arriving just before the land cracked and before the man inside forgot how to look out. Jed said nothing. He stood in the kitchen's shadow, one hand resting on the windowsill. His fingers were still dusted with sawdust from the firewood, and now something else clung to them. Hesitation, not fear, not suspicion, but the reflex of a man who once opened a door and lost the world for doing so. Outside, the scene froze like a frame in time. The apple tree held still. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The 10 women stood like dead trees in drought. No wind, no words, only gazes, not pleading, but the gaze of those who had been turned away before, who had lost everything and still chose to stop again before a stranger's door. They didn't know who he was, didn't know this was the place where hope was buried. But they stood, and that, more than any word, caused the faintest crack to form in Jed's heart. Not yet forgiveness, not yet trust, just the first tremor, after 8 years of living only to forget. Part 6. The nod no one saw. He didn't open the gate, but that night he left the kitchen door unlatched. Evening drew in slowly, like an old man folding himself into sleep. The sun pulled back from the fence, then from the fields, then all the wool, way to the foot of the far mountains, leaving the house cloaked in the ashen light of day's end. Outside, the 10 Apache women still stood, shoulders sagging under the weight of something they could not put down. Jed didn't step onto the porch. He didn't bar the door either. He quietly drew water from the well, poured it into a tin bucket, and placed it by the fence. He said nothing, made no gestures, offered no explanation. He just left it and turned away. Beside the water, he placed a half-used sack of cornmeal. A clean cloth wrapped around 3 dried onions and an old kitchen knife, once used by Mrs. Boone to slice vegetables. Not much, but for a man who had nothing left, it was everything he could give. No one came to take it right away. By nightfall, it all remained untouched. Jed didn't return a second time. He lit the oil lamp, stoked the stove, and set water to boil. That night he still prepared 2 bowls of rice, but for the first time in years he didn't place the second across from himself. He set it instead on the kitchen counter, near the window, near the porch, near the silence that was beginning to take shape. The night wind wasn't strong, but it carried the soft murmurs of the earth, the kind only those who have buried loved ones can understand. Jed sat in his wooden chair, watching the fire burn. Rufus curled up at his feet, ears twitching at every small sound, but never barking. Outside, the wind nudged the shutters, making a sound like footsteps, arriving, then leaving. When the wall clock, no longer ticking, used only for looking, pointed to 11:07, the hour when everything once shattered, Jed rose, walked toward the kitchen door. His hand reached for the wooden bar he used to lock it, but paused. Not because he forgot, not out of laziness, but because tonight he didn't want to hear that sound. The sound of one more thing closing between people. He stepped away as if he'd never approached, walked slowly to his room, leaving the lamp lit. Before lying down, he quietly folded a thin blanket and left it on the end of the bench near the kitchen entrance. He didn't say anyone would need it. He just left it there. The next morning, as light spilled through the western window, Jed opened the kitchen door. The cornmeal sack was lighter. The water bucket half empty, the cloth and onions gone. But the dull knife had been returned, washed clean and laid carefully on a stone, handle turned gently towards the house. In the disturbed dust on the ground were faint footprints, a child's, not deep, just far enough to reach, then retreat. Jed stood for a long while, didn't smile, didn't sigh. He stepped onto the porch, sat on the steps, rested his chin on one hand, and gazed at the sun-faded fence. From the old stable, a soft clink of metal, as if someone was adjusting the tin roof's lashings. But when Jed stood and went to look, no one was there. Only the silhouette of a woman, bent low, gently pulling a thorn from a child's foot, then lifting the child in arms that had carried too much, one of the 10 Apache women. She didn't glance his way, didn't wave, didn't nod. But the way she knelt, pulled up the child's leg, used that worn knife to pry out the splinter, that was an answer. Quiet, unhurried, not meant to be seen, but enough to make him stay standing a little longer. And Jed, a man who had bolted his heart shut for 8 long years, did not step out to welcome anyone, did not say a single word. But that night, he left the kitchen door unlatched. See Part 7, The Wordless Meal. The next morning, the empty chair had been cleaned, and on the table sat a wooden bowl, not the one he used. Jed rose before the light had fully arrived. It was a habit he'd kept even before the house lost its voices. While the chickens still scratched at the dirt, while dew clung to the window like the breath of someone long gone, he had already dressed, lit the stove, and set water to boil. Rufus lay by the hearth, head resting on crossed paws, eyes half closed. No one spoke, but the old dog's presence was still part of the rhythm, the last echo of a life that once had laughter, small footsteps across the floor, and the scent of fresh cornbread. Jed washed his bowl, drying it with a cloth whose frayed edges told of years. But as he set his wooden bowl on the table, he paused. There, at the edge near the window where the first light always touched, was another bowl. Not his, old. A few scratches around the rim, still faintly warm, as if just rinsed or placed there only moments ago. No one in his house had ever owned such a bowl. No one ever had. Jed stepped closer, didn't touch, just looked. The bowl sat atop the tablecloth, still spread out, even though he always folded it before eating. This time it remained open, as if someone had sat there, or simply had permission to exist there. He looked around. No one. Rufus was in the corner, unmoved. The stove still burned. Nothing seemed to have changed. But everything wasn't quite the same either. No knock, no greeting, no note. Only a quiet gesture, an answer to a quiet offering. Jed poured his coffee, sat in his usual chair. The chair across from him, where he had placed the second bowl all these years, had been wiped clean. No dust. The gnawed corner from termites had been shaved down, smoothed with a blade. Someone had sat there, not to ask, but to share. Jed didn't look out the window. He didn't need to. He knew they were still there, behind the house, or resting in the old barn no longer in use. That morning he ate more slowly than usual. Not because the food was cold, not from indifference, but because something inside him no longer felt still. Not quite warm, not yet stirred, but something had tapped gently within. Like when you touch a stone that's rested in the stream too long and find it still, cool but no longer cold. After the meal, he washed both bowls, his and the one that wasn't his. He dried the unfamiliar one with the same care, then returned it to where it had been. Didn't put it away. Didn't return it to anyone, just left it, because maybe tomorrow morning it would be used again. No voices filled the house. Only the breath of fire and something very small, something unnamed, but enough to make Jed sit just a little longer after breakfast, because for the first time in years, he hadn't eaten alone. Part 8. The Return of Something Old. A man came on horseback, knocked with the butt of a rifle, No greeting needed. That morning the air stood still. The sun wasn't harsh, but dry, the kind of dryness that cracked the hands, not from cold, but from silence stretched too long. Jed was cutting grass near the fence when Rufus growled. Not loud, not fierce, just enough to say someone was coming, but not a friend. A horse's hoofbeats heavy and slow like the sound of regret. A figure emerged at the end of the dirt road. A dust-colored scarf, worn leather coat, and a rifle strapped to the saddle like an extra limb. Jed stood up, leaning his hoe into the soil. Not smiling, not afraid. The rider didn't tie up the horse, just stopped at the gate. Didn't ask a name, didn't seek directions. Just looked at Jed, walked to the door, and knocked with the rifle's butt. 4 times, slow, like knocking on a grave that hadn't yet been closed. Jed didn't open the door. He didn't have to. That door no longer kept anyone in, or anyone out. He stood where he was, hands still dirty with earth. The man spoke, not a question, not an accusation, just a statement flat as sun-baked stone. They know you're harboring the enemy. No anger, no posse behind him, no shouting Apache, just a message, an old warning spoken in a voice that had dried out long ago. Jed didn't reply. There was no need. The man didn't leave right away. Didn't enter either. His eyes scanned the porch, saw the faint indent where someone had sat last night. Then they traveled down to Jed's hands, rough but steady. Finally they rested on Jed's eyes, the same eyes that once saw his son fall in the Stone Valley so many years ago. Neither man spoke of it, but it hovered between them, clear as the smell of rust in autumn air. A breeze passed, carrying the scent of freshly cut hay, and the scent of human presence, a scent only someone who's lived too long alone could notice first. The rider didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't threaten. He simply turned his horse. No hurry, no farewell. The hoofprints lingered in the dirt until the wind began to erase them. Jed turned, looked toward the back of the house, to the rise of land where 3 round stones lay like pillows. One of them marked his wife's grave. He didn't go to it, just looked and remembered that the last time he trusted someone was also the last time he'd lost everything. Rufus followed him inside. The door wasn't locked. The latch rusted, not from carelessness, but because he'd grown used to no one wanting in. But today someone had looked in, if only to remind him that the past can come back, and sometimes it comes on horseback without needing to fire a shot. Jed poured water. Not for anyone, just set it down, and sat, no sigh, no shaking hands. Only a small thing returned to his eyes, something he hadn't felt in years: concern. On Part 9. A night with strange wind. He latched the door, then opened it, then left it ajar, for the first time in 8 years. Night fell quicker than usual, not because of clouds, but because Jed's mind began to knot, like the old rope in the barn, the one once used to tie horses, now lying still in a forgotten corner. That evening Jed lit the stove earlier than usual, not for the cold, but for the sound of the fire's crackle to drown out the noise inside his head. Rufus sat at the back door, eyes fixed on the dark slope of the hill, the one no one named, but which had held his gaze since dusk. Jed walked to the front door, placed his hand on the wooden latch, fastened it, slowly. Then he turned to the kitchen door, opened it, then left it halfway closed. He said nothing, but the way he looked at the narrow gap, it felt like he was letting something go and keeping something in. A faint scent drifted into the house, not smoke, not grass, but something else, the smell of skin that had slept beneath open skies for many nights, a scent that only someone who'd been alone too long could recognize. Jed went to the barn, not for the horses, but for an old blanket, the one that still held his wife's scent on damp days. No explanation, no plan. He folded it carefully, brought it to the back porch, and placed it on the wooden bench where he used to store salt sacks for the livestock. Not at the door, not in the yard, just there. Then he went back inside. The oil lamp still burned. The second bowl of rice remained on the table. But tonight, for the first time, he added a pair of chopsticks, deliberately, without a word, without thinking of anyone in particular, just action, the kind a man makes when he's been wounded so deeply he's learned to live with the pain like it's a quiet companion. Rufus never left the door. He lay down, head resting on an old rag, as if he too understood. This night was not like others. Something was coming, not on horseback, not with guns, but with a shift in the air around a man who had grown used to stillness. Before going to bed, Jed looked once more toward the kitchen door. It remained ajar, no sounds, no footsteps, no knocks, but the wind had changed. It carried something unnamed, a bit of acceptance, a thread of doubt, and a fragile question. Would anyone know that he had opened the door? He didn't expect an answer. He only hoped that his loneliness wouldn't stay invisible forever. Part 10. A collar around the dog's neck. Rufus, the old dog, ran around wearing a new collar woven from corn husk and chestnut bark. The next morning dawned clear and still, like a forgotten lake in a highland valley. Jed woke later than usual, not from fatigue, not from laziness, but because sleep had come slowly the night before, drifting in like wind through the cracks in the boards. He pulled on his boots, opened the door. Rufus wasn't on the porch where he always lay. The old dog was so faithful you could tell time by where he slept. But today he had wandered off early. Jed scanned the yard. No fresh tracks, no people, only the strange stillness of air that felt as if someone had passed through, leaving nothing behind but one thing. Rufus returned just as sunlight began warming the eastern fence. He didn't bark, just trotted past the step, then circled the chicken coop as if checking that all was still where it should be. Jed was about to go back inside when something made him pause. Not because it was strange, but because it was so familiar that even the smallest difference could stop his heart for a moment. Around Rufus's neck, replacing the frayed old twine, was a new collar, braided from corn husk, chestnut bark, and a small strip of soft deerskin, hand-woven, delicate, no decoration, no boast, not too new, not too worn, as if it had been waiting somewhere for the right moment. Jed didn't rush over. He sat on the step, not looking straight at the dog, as if afraid that doing so might make something vanish. Just a sidelong glance, enough to see the double knot at the end of the braid. Careful, patient, unhurried. He didn't remove the collar, didn't pat Rufus's head, as he usually did. He just sat, in silence, fingers brushing dust from his left boot, a meaningless motion, but one that kept him from being overcome by something he didn't know how to name. Maybe it was the eldest woman. Maybe the little boy with the worn knife. Maybe someone he never even saw clearly. It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had left something without asking for anything in return. No bread, no rations, no promises, just a collar for a dog. Owned by a man who had long believed no one remembered the small things. The binding wasn't tight, nor loose, just right. As if the one who made it understood how an old dog's neck swells when barking and softens when it sighs from loneliness. Jed didn't go inside right away. He stood looking toward the distant hills. The sun had just crested the chestnut trees, casting a soft line of gold, like a memory not yet spoken aloud. Inside him, no joy, no gratitude, just a small warm spot, like a coal left behind in ashes he thought had gone cold. Maybe from now on, he wasn't the only one leaving something behind. Later out of Colgate Schmeichel, Part 11, Rumors and a Warm Loaf of Bread. The town found out, but instead of punishment, someone left bread at his door, no name attached. The town was called Dry Willow, a name that whispered of what no longer bloomed but still stood. In Dry Willow, news didn't travel by letter, but by eyes, by glances at the water pump, by soft coughs on the mercy porch, by someone lingering too long outside the blacksmith's. Everyone knew, everyone pretended not to, but the knowing moved quietly, like a hammer tapping a horseshoe, not loud but echoing far across the edge between silence and suspicion. Some claimed they'd seen small footprints near Boone's stone well. Others whispered that every night the kitchen lamp stayed lit late, the kind of light only those who've lost a family can recognize. No one asked, no one approached. But within the town's heart, the story began weaving itself from threads of fear, caution, and a small, fragile strand of gratitude. 3 days after Rufus came home, wearing the new collar, a light rain fell. The earth stayed dry, but the air smelled like change. Jed was bringing in firewood when he saw it, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, carefully knotted as if to keep out the rain. He didn't open it right away, just crouched, fingers brushing the edge of the fabric, like someone who used to read letters but had long forgotten how to read words. Inside, a loaf of bread, fresh, still warm, no note, no message, no one waiting for a reply. Jed brought it inside. Didn't eat it, not at first. He placed it on the table, across from the wooden chair that had stayed empty for years. A little later he poured tea. 2 cups. No explanation, and like a rhythm repeating from the dark inside him, he sat across from someone who wasn't there. Just the bread, and the scent of tea, and that strange familiar feeling that even in silence, someone out there had chosen to stand beside him. Maybe it was the widow from town, the one he helped rethatch her roof after the winter storm. Maybe it was the boy he once gave a bag of seed during the harvest festival. Maybe no one at all. Maybe just someone who could see a small kindness and refused to let it die in silence. Jed didn't tell anyone, didn't ask Rufus, didn't track footprints, but that night he folded the blanket more neatly, placed one of his best oak logs by the fire, and moved the second cup a little closer to the other side of the table. There was no great joy in his chest, just this. A weight lifted slightly, and the feeling that his existence was no longer entirely invisible. Part 12. They left at first light.
No farewell, no voice, only footprints trailing toward the horizon, northward. That morning the rooster stayed quiet. Only the wind spoke, passing beneath the eaves like a message no one had written. Jed woke early, not from habit, but from
something vague in his chest, like someone had just stepped out of a dream before he could open his eyes. He stepped onto the porch, stood still. Not to search, just to listen. But there was no clatter of cooking pots, no faint glow of embers behind the firestones, no soft movement under the chestnut trees, where the Apache women had kept their children warm. The clearings was empty. The trampled grass now stood upright again. The red earth held no more heavy footprints. Only a long, quiet trail leading north into fog, where hills rise to meet the morning sky. They were gone. No door was knocked, no goodbye spoken, not even a note, as if silence itself was the only thank you they believed he'd understand. But Jed wasn't surprised. He'd seen it in their eyes from the very first night. Those weren't the eyes of people seeking refuge. They were the eyes of people passing through, leaving, not because they didn't want to stay, but because they didn't want anyone to suffer for standing with them. On the step where he'd once placed a clean cloth and a pail of water, now sat a bundle of herbs, neatly tied in oak leaves, and a rough linen pouch filled with dry seeds. No blanket, no valuables, only seeds, of something not yet grown, of something that might rise, if someone was patient enough to water it. Jed sat on the step. A cup of tea warmed his palm. He didn't drink, just held it, as if the warmth in his hand might hold someone back for one more moment. But nothing stays, just as nothing held him back when he walked away from Trust 8 years ago. The wind swept past the roof, whistling gently through the bent slats. Jed closed his eyes, exhaled a breath long and aching, a fatigue he had never dared to speak aloud. He didn't feel loss, only a new emptiness, light but lingering. No one knew their names, where they came from, where they'd go. And maybe it didn't matter, because once someone trusts you enough to step across the border of silence, even for a short while, that trust does not vanish. It only asks that you hold it long enough to keep it alive. In part 13, the apple tree bore fruit again. He didn't replant beans, but sowed the seeds they left behind. The next season, the apple tree bore its first fruit in 5 years. April turned quietly. The western earth doesn't rush to change seasons. It stays dry, stubborn, like someone who's learned, over years of silence, how to withhold trust. But even soil, if touched the right way, can still offer something nameless and new. Jed no longer walked the bean rows each morning. The field had withered, he let it be. Weeds grew through the paths, and wind laid a soft film of dust over every old crack in the dirt. He didn't plant beans again. Instead, on a chilly morning in early spring, he took the linen pouch of seeds out from the drawer where it had waited all winter. He began digging a new row behind the house, beneath the old apple tree. He and his wife had planted that tree together. She once said, "The land doesn't remember borders. Only trees do." For 3 years it had borne fruit. Then no more. Since the day she died, and their son was taken in that chase long ago, the tree had stopped blooming. He had thought of cutting it down more than once, but each time he raised the axe, his hand let go. There was something in its roots, in the quiet bend of its trunk, that stopped him. As if the tree was mourning too, only in its own silent way. That season he planted again, not to harvest, but because his hands needed to be dirty again, because the soil needed turning, not to grow, but to remember how to live. The seeds were tiny, mustard-sized, from the Apache's cloth pouch, but holding them reminded him of years ago, walking the fields hand in hand with his son. They smelled like the unknown, and sometimes that's all a living man needs. Each evening he carried water from the well, walked slowly, and watered the rows in silence. He didn't expect quick sprouts, didn't rush the season, just the act, repeated, like the second bowl of rice he'd placed for years. And then one day the apple tree budded, not all at once like when his wife was alive, just one blossom, then a pale nub, and by early September, when the first mist touched the soil, a single apple, small, round, its skin marked with deep red freckles like the cheek of someone weathered with time. It hung quiet on the branch, curved toward the house. Jed didn't pick it, didn't touch it, just sat nearby, watching, afraid that to reach for it might break something too delicate, and in that quiet he understood what grows from seeds isn't only in the soil. Inside the house he took down a door that had stayed locked for 8 years. He didn't fix it, just opened it, let sunlight in. He replaced the hinges, swept dust from the windowsill, and set a small wooden chair, the kind with a low back, by the hearth. Not for anyone, just in case. If someone ever returned, that place would be ready. Part 14. A Little Girl and New Seeds. At summer's end, an Apache girl returned, set down a small bundle, and left without a word. Late August. The sun over dry willow grew thin, like cotton muslin pulled across the sky, no longer fierce, but not yet soft. Its light stained everything in gold. Weathered wood, the old stone well, and the shape of a man splitting firewood out back. Jed didn't count days, but his body knew, somehow, that the season was shifting. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves. Tiny birds resumed their tapping at his windows each morning. Rufus slept closer to the door, as if waiting for something familiar that hadn't arrived in a long while. That morning there were no footsteps, no knock, just a shadow standing still, neat as a pencil sketch, forgotten in the wide expanse of the west. A young Apache girl, 12, maybe 13, stood at Jed's front door like she hadn't just come, but had always been there. She placed a small cloth bundle on the step. No boo of the head. No words. She didn't meet his gaze, but didn't avoid it either. She did one thing, as if someone had told her long ago. Step barefoot onto the porch, set the bundle down, turn through the weathered fence, and dissolve into the honey-colored grass. Jed didn't call out, didn't rise right away, just let the axe fall from his hand, as if laying down an old question he no longer needed answered. Later he stepped to the porch. The bundle was tied with braided twine, strong, like the knots of those who know how to pack game in the forest. Inside, a handful of small, dry seeds wrapped in crisp leaves, seeds he'd never seen. And a single feather, long, silver-gray, smoothed as if it had been combed by the gentlest fingers of autumn. He picked it up, then set it down, then picked it up again. Rufus circled his feet, then sat, head tilted, as if wondering too. But no one said anything. No one had to. That night Jed wrote for the first time in years, in the notebook with curled edges and insect-bit corners. His hand trembled, but the words came clear. Someone remembers the way back. Just one line, no more, none needed. Because some things, when real enough, deep enough, can only be kept whole in silence. That winter came late. The apple tree bore 2 more fruits. The back garden sprouted strange greens. Jed didn't know their names, but he cared for each row, as if he had known them long before they were ever planted, and inside him something small, like sunlight through old timber, was beginning to grow. That trust, when not forced, will come back, and it might look like nothing more than a child, a bundle of seeds, and a man who doesn't ask, but waits quietly. Perhaps the old man still lives there, where the apple tree now bears fruit once a year, and the chair by the hearth no longer gathers dust. No one knows his real name. No one needs to. Some people go their whole lives without being remembered. They only ever needed someone to come back once. If you've ever had a long winter inside your chest, if you've ever shut the world out but quietly left an empty chair behind, then maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what he came to understand. That kindness, no matter how late it arrives, is still the only thing that can take root again. If a moment in this story made you fall silent, leave a line below. Not to say much, but so that someone else might see it. We will read it, as if we're sitting beside you in that quiet chair by the fire.